Okay, hi everyone. The focus of this week is a topic which some of you have heard me talk about before, and the topic is environmental justice. Now, it should really be termed environmental injustice. I think that would be a more straightforward term because we're talking about a situation that is morally and ethically not right. Uh, some people refer to this topic as environmental racism, which is probably even a better term because in the minds of many people, the situation revolving around environmental justice is considered a direct form of racism. We talked about race and racism earlier in the class, and this, in the minds of many people, is motivated by those kinds of racist ideas and racist ideologies that we talked a little bit about that justify discrimination, that justify certain inequitable and unjust situations. But in general, this topic is referred to as environmental justice. And let's see, here's a couple of pictures. I'd like to start off with pictures. Sometimes pictures can tell 1,000 words, and this is a pretty good one. It starts to get at a relationship here where you can see a factory, and you get the sense that it's emitting something that includes toxic chemicals. We don't know for sure from this picture, but most likely. And here is a playground right adjacent to the factory, and we see some people of color here playing. And so this starts to kind of illustrate this idea of environmental justice or injustice or racism. In this picture here, we see a number of plants, and this is kind of typical of the situation where plants, industries, factories, whatever we want to call them, that emit toxic chemicals into the environment, into the air or groundwater as a result of their productive operations, tend to be congregated together in one particular place. And then unfortunately, they're often located close to communities. So a definition for environmental racism is the targeting of poor communities of color for toxic waste disposal and the citing of polluting industries. So we've got, on the one hand, communities that are poor and predominantly made up of minorities, and they're close to a disposal site. This could be a landfill or some kind of industrial recycling kind of operation, or the siting of polluting industries, chemical industry, oil industry. So there's a whole host of sources of pollutants that have to be located somewhere. So there's a lot of research on this topic now. In the last 20 years, this topic became more and more popular, and a lot of academics, scholars started studying it. And so there's a lot of research out there. Here are just two statistics that we can focus on that really illustrate the magnitude of the problem. 3 out of 5 African Americans and Latinos live in communities with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. And that's quite a phenomenal statistics. One more, 40% of hazardous waste landfills in the US are located in predominantly Black or Latino communities. So we could go on with statistics like this. And so researchers have seen this pattern emerge. Again, going back, well, really it started in the 1980s, as I'll talk about in a minute. But then in the 90s and 2000s, more and more studies were being done on this particular problem. And this stark pattern emerged that across the country, particularly in urban areas, but not necessarily only urban areas, you find this pattern. So the environmental justice, the environmental justice movement, you can see the acronym there at the top, the EJ movement. It's often referred to as EJ. This EJ movement began in the early 1980s in Warren County, North Carolina. And when we say it began here in the sense that people started protesting this particular situation. Prior to this, you had sources of toxic emissions, industrial facilities, landfills, and so on, located close to poor minority communities, but it hadn't really gotten a lot of attention. And beginning in the 1980s, there emerged somewhat of a civil rights movement where people were organizing, but this time directed or including the environmental issue. Okay, so story starts here, and it's kind of a really interesting, although tragic, thing that happened here in North Carolina. In 1978, there was a company run by a few incompetent people, and they had to get rid of 31,000 gallons of PCB contaminated transformer oil. This is really toxic stuff. PCBs are used in like these electronic transformers, and they were very common. But we now know that PCBs are very toxic, so you have to handle it very carefully. This company was responsible for recycling this stuff. Now, these idiots wanted to save some money, so they took this 31,000 gallons of PCB contaminated oil, transformer oil, and they dumped it along 270 miles of roads somewhere in North Carolina. So they thought they would get away with it, but they didn't. Somehow they got caught. And the state had to step in and clean this stuff up. The company just basically declared bankruptcy, and the owners kind of left town and didn't take any responsibility for cleaning up the PCB material that they dumped. So the state of California was responsible for cleaning it up. Now, to do so, you have to build a specially designed hazardous waste landfill. It can't just be a normal, regular landfill. It's got to meet certain standards to properly hold and contain PCBs. So they looked around North Carolina looking for a site. There were a number of sites available. There were several sites available. They chose a community called Choco Township in Warren County. If you look at the map, you can see there's an arrow to a square kind of towards the center of Warren County. And this is Choco Township. And they chose this township, and it was going to be a big landfill. It would receive 6,000 truckloads of the PCB dirt that had been dumped by that company. But it was also, in addition to that, going to accept a lot of industrial waste from around the state of North Carolina. Now, what is at least not surprising now when we look back on it, I think it was a shock to a lot of people at the time, but now it's not surprising that 70% or 69% of the people who lived in this community were African American, and 20% of the residents were poor. So they were pretty outraged, and there's an interesting book written on this topic here. It's in one of my next PowerPoints coming up that talks about the history of this movement and how it emerged. But some of those activists who started organizing the residents had some experience in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So it was a civil rights movement to protest, not necessarily focused just on racial inequality as the 1960s civil rights movement was. This was also focused on environmental inequity or inequality. Here's the book I was talking about, Dumping in Dixie. And it was written by this guy on the left here, Robert Bullard. And he's published a lot of research on the problem of environmental justice. He's the leading person in this field. And you can see the picture on the cover of his book. This was a protest that took place in this Shoko Township, where people were lying on the street blocking trucks coming in to develop the landfill. And so it took about 25 years before the landfill was closed and cleaned up. The protest here was not successful. It did not prevent the siting of the landfill or the placing of the PCB material in the landfill, but it was very successful in raising awareness, and awareness that spread throughout the country. And today there's a lot of environmental justice grassroots organizations that are committed to trying to eradicate or alleviate racial, environmental injustice and racism. And again, there's been a lot of research on the topic now. We now know a lot more about it. This is a interesting YouTube video that you can watch. The link is on Canvas, and it's a couple minutes about the PCB protests in Warren County in 1982. Here's another book written on environmental justice. I put the pictures of a few books up here just to kind of give you a flavor for the different studies and books and journal articles that are out there. This is one by a scholar named Julian Hagerman, and I've seen her name quite a bit. Here's another book by Bunyan Bryant, I think his name. I've seen his name frequently on publications. There's a book he wrote, Environmental Justice, Issues, Policies, and Solutions. And in this book, they include some international situations of environmental racism. There's another book by Eduardo Rooks, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, Environmental Justice in America, A New Paradigm. So this is a map that appeared in a really good article that was written in the 1990s, so it was a while ago. But I would say that I think this was around 1996, I guess. But this is when some of the really good studies came out on environmental justice. And this was a really good article, and typically in the research on environmental justice, scholars will include maps that juxtapose the location of various environmental hazards with the demographics of a particular area. And this really illustrates this point really well. I have a couple of maps here from this particular article that they wrote about environmental racism in Santa Clara County. So in this map, to start off with, if you look at the yellow squares, those represent a company, called a company or a firm or a facility or a business. You can use really any of those terms to describe some kind of business operation that is making something. And in the process of making whatever they're making, they're emitting a toxic chemical. Now it's kind of another story. The data here that they used for this study are from the toxic release inventory. So, for example, if you looked in your down the left-hand corner, you see next to the yellow square, there's the term TRI facilities. TRI stands for toxic release inventory. So, in a nutshell, the EPA keeps track of large companies that are emitting certain kinds of chemicals into the environment that have the potential to cause cancer in humans. So this is where they're located. Now, the brown layered colors represent the demographics of the communities. And I think this is probably at the census tract level. Sometimes scholars use census tracts, or sometimes they use zip codes. Sometimes they use larger areas. This looks like census tracts. And you can see here that the lighter shade of brown represents lower income areas. So the lightest shade of brown here, the median income is somewhere between 0 and $26,598. So people that live there are generally poor. Then you can look and see how the median income increases. And there are 4 levels here. The darkest brown color are the wealthier communities. If anybody's been to Santa Clara County, you might recognize some of these areas as the wealthier communities. The darker brown areas, the median income fell somewhere between $56,000 and $150,000. So you can see the pattern here, and this is illustrative of a pattern that exists in many other places throughout the country. The toxic facilities tend to be located in lower income communities. Some research has used pretty sophisticated statistical and mapping techniques to try and really measure the location between plants and low-income communities. So there's some interesting research out there. Here's that same map, but this time the TRI facilities are juxtaposed with percent Latino. The Bay Area, Santa Clara in particular, has a very large Latino population. And so in this case, the darker the brown color, the higher percentage of Latinos that live in that particular area. And so again, we see a pattern here. It's not perfect, but it's still nonetheless a significant pattern between the location of communities and the concentration of Latino residents. And okay, I think in this particular study, there's a couple of more maps, but I just wanted to use these two to illustrate kind of the idea here and the method for analyzing environmental racism. Now here's another map of Los Angeles. This is also, the green dots here are these TRI facilities, the same facilities that were used in the previous study. Now, not all the research uses TRI facilities. There's a wide range of ways to look at and locate and map sources of environmental hazards. This TRI is one way to do it. And it's a good illustration here again of looking at this pattern. So the green dots again are companies that are releasing toxic emissions into the environment. And then the map here shows the demographics. And in this case, it's people of color. So the areas that are red, people that live in those areas, 80 to 100% are people of color. And then you can go down, there's again 4 categories here. And the yellow has the lowest percentage of people of color. And so again, you can see the pattern here. It's not 100% perfect, but it's pretty darn pronounced. The location of these facilities are in or proximate to communities with people of color. So a lot of it has been written about, why does this exist? And, it has to do with a number of things. It has to do with overt racism. Sometimes companies specifically target these areas because they know that low-income minorities are probably less likely to do anything about it. The poor can't afford to hire expensive lawyers. Poor tend to be busier and working all the time. There's also other things going on. Sometimes the people that live in these communities actually welcome these plants to be in their communities because they provide some decent jobs in terms of at least some decent pay, so you can pay your rent and put food on the table. So this oftentimes becomes a problem because the people who are employed in these facilities often live there. They're being subject to high rates of exposure to these toxic chemicals, yet they're not complaining. And in a way you can understand if somebody has a family to support and needs a job and is making a decent living, perhaps a lucrative living, it's hard to argue against that sometimes. Another problem is land use. That one reason why these plants are located in particular areas, especially that they're concentrated in particular areas, has to do with land use decisions that may have been made decades ago. In the Los Angeles area, for example, there's a lot of polluting plants concentrated in commerce, the commerce area, the city of Commerce. And that has to do with, in part, land use decisions that were made in the 1930s. So in some cases, the polluting companies were already there, and low-income minorities move in after the fact. So that also becomes a problem. Now, the reason why low-income people are moving into these areas is because nobody else wants to live there. Those who can afford it are not going to. So that's another dimension to this whole kind of problem. So here's a great case study of an environmental justice issue in which the community organized and mobilized and fought against and ultimately was able to shut them down. This was the Exide Vernon Recycling Center. and they recycled batteries, car batteries. I think it was primarily car batteries. It might have been other kinds of batteries also. And the community activists, as well as some environmental regulators and scientists, started to find high levels of lead and sulfur um, and arsenic, other things in the soil around the Exide plant. And not surprisingly, a lot of low-income minority residents lived near the plant. You can see on this map here where it's located. It was located. It's now shut down. Here are 3 YouTube videos, and I'll put the links up on Canvas, that give you some background of what happened. And so they were finally forced to close a year or 2 ago. And so really interesting and revealing kind of case study of an environmental racist kind of situation. And it is interesting that here's a picture of a local community, organizing a march against a particular polluting facility. This is a picture of people working for East Yard Communities. They're an environmental justice organization located, I think they're in the city of Commerce, and they do some really good work. They organize people, inform people of the situation, lobby local political leaders to try to encourage them, force them to take actions to help mitigate the problem in some way. So a lot of interesting things going on out there in this area, and it might add some decent job opportunities. Working for a nonprofit organization, doing environmental justice grassroots work. There are also, at the city, county, and state level, environmental regulatory agencies that are involved in environmental justice issues. Okay, so I think that's it for this week. There's also a really great video posted on Canvas. And this particular video, while it's a little bit dated, it came out in the 1990s, I believe. I think it's the best video still on environmental justice. The video is about environmental justice in Chester, Pennsylvania. And it has a long history, and it's still going on today. So it's not like a past issue that doesn't have any relevance today. Still in Chester, Pennsylvania, the residents are still fighting to try and prevent more toxic recycling facilities to come into their community, and still trying to fight to hold the companies accountable. And this particular documentary, again, was filmed back in the 90s, but it's a really good one. Okay, so that's about it for, I think, this week, and see you later.